But then at the end of the video, Mr. Poilievre sort of ends up by saying, and the answer to all of this is no government spending. And you almost get whiplash because everything he said actually talks about the need for some kind of intervention. Even when the Conservatives say we are going to set targets and link it to infrastructure money for municipalities, that's government intervention. So the notion that cutting government spending is a magic bullet solution bears no resemblance to the rest of the video.
Welcome to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy. I'm Clement Nokos, editor of Perspectives Journal and director of policy and engagement at the Broadband Institute. I sat down before the December 2023 holidays to speak to Professor Carolyn Whitzman, housing and social policy consultant, an expert advisor to the Housing Assessment Resource Tools Project at the University of British Columbia, and an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa's Department of Geography, Environment, and Geomatics, to ask her just what are Canadian progressives getting wrong and right about housing affordability. This past summer, she wrote a piece in the Globe and Mail entitled "Canada's Progressive Parties Have Lost the Plot on the Housing Crisis," responding to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's blunt statement earlier that summer that housing is simply not a federal responsibility. In her piece, she asked, what's with the silence from allegedly more progressive parties on the doubling of the quantum of non-market housing, a policy that has been recommended by everyone from the industry body for community housing to one of Canada's big banks? She also asks, why not talk about housing in terms of industrial policy, something that we do love to talk about here at Perspectives Journal, and the role of government in building more housing supply instead of trying to outflank Pierre Poilievre's inconsistent policy slogans from the right wing. And since then, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has stated that governments should get out of home building even after Prime Minister Trudeau already confirmed that. So clearly, getting government into home building isn't what's behind the present affordability crisis we all face today. And meanwhile, progressives have yet to propose big plans to get government back into housing, while 2/3 of Canadians, polled by Leger in early December, said that they wanted the federal government to spend more money on its housing strategy. But in recent months, a number of new spending announcements and policy changes have come out of Social Democratic administrations in British Columbia and Toronto, talking about big spends and policy changes to jumpstart building out the supply for decommodified non-market housing. Is this even close enough? And what exactly are progressives getting wrong and right about housing affordability? Professor Whitzman, thank you for joining me for this dialogue on the Perspectives Journal podcast to help me answer these questions.
Happy to be here, Clement.
So to start, I think what bears repeating, though it's been often discussed, is the definition of affordable housing, for clarification.
Well, the human rights definition of affordable housing is housing costs that don't stop you from other necessities like food or transport or education. Around the world, for instance, the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, defines affordable housing as no more than 30% of pre-tax household income or no more than 40% of post-tax household income. That's a arbitrary number, but the advantage of that number is it's been measured by the census since 1991. It's a measure that is used around the world. One of the tricks, though, is that the CMHC used to, and by used to, I mean from the beginnings of the CMHC in the 1940s until the abandonment of housing policy by the federal government, used income categories. So it looked at the lowest quintile of household income and said, these are low-income people. They have the biggest housing problems. And then they looked at the next quintile and they said, these are moderate-income people. We need to make sure, for instance, that there are market rental and home ownership options that are affordable for them. And one of the real disappointments of the current reentry into affordable housing is that we're not talking about who needs affordable housing, where and at what cost. And we can't really do that without getting beyond a concept of sort of middle income affordability and starting to dig down into low and moderate income affordability.
And so in addition to the nuances behind the definition of quote-unquote affordable housing, you also have policymakers debate terms like non-market housing, what some may call public housing, and then you also have the ideas of financialization, commodification, and decommodification of housing. How do you go about explaining and nuancing these particular terms, and how do they fit in the idea of affordable housing?
I'll start off with a basic division, which is between market housing, sometimes called private development, that is driven by profit, and non-market housing, which is at least supposed to be driven by public good. So if there are any profits, they're sort of plowed back into more affordable housing. So that would include public housing. Public housing is anything that's owned by a level of government, usually in Canada these days, it's municipal housing. Then there's cooperative housing, and in Canada that usually means housing that is co-owned by the tenants and run in a nonprofit way. In other words, you don't need to buy anything to live in the co-op. You don't get anything when you move out of a co-op. And then the third category would be what's internationally called community housing, but in Canada, there's a whole bunch of different terms for it. But basically, it's housing provided by a nonprofit organization and usually includes supportive housing, which is housing that has health and social supports attached to the housing. So there's market housing, and that is 95% of housing in Canada. And then there's non-market housing, which is a very small stump. It's like 5% of housing in Canada. When we talk about commodification or financialization, what it really means is housing that is intended to make profits, be high return investments, as opposed to homes as a place for people to live in. So again, that's 95% of the housing in Canada.
And on that distinction between the 95% of market housing in Canada versus the very small proportion of non-market housing, I see this tension between the need for profits among some who believe that's what drives housing supply in Canada, and the requisite need for housing to be a human right. And so how does a housing policy advocate like yourself approach that contention between profits and human rights?
Well, look, I've always come at urban issues from the perspective of human rights. So housing is an odd thing. It is a human right. The National Housing Strategy Act of 2019 says it's a right. But unlike, let's say, healthcare in Canada, or education in Canada, the majority of which is provided on a non-market, non-profit basis through the government. Housing is primarily provided by the private market. A little bit like food is a necessity. There is a right to life, which would include adequate food, but most of it's produced by the private sector. In that case, it's the job of the government to make sure that everyone has access to that right. So what that means in terms of non-market housing is it's, again, since the 1940s, the Canadian government has been accepting the fact that for the lowest income 20% of the population, there aren't any good private market solutions. So there does need to be a substantial amount of non-market housing. In the 1940s, the first major report on housing said a third of all new housing should be non-market. In France, there's been targets for municipalities to have 20% non-market housing since 2000. That's been true whether it's a right-wing government or a left-wing government. So there does need to be much more non-market housing than there is. And the abandonment of non-market housing in the 1990s coincides and really causes the growing tide of homelessness. When it comes to the private sector housing, on the one hand, you can't just say, wow, all developers are evil, because to me, it would be like saying, gee, I don't have a doctor, so all doctors must be evil. Well, let's put it this way. I think that landlords need to be licensed. I think there need to be rules. I think we need to protect the rights of both tenants and home buyers. So that's part of the right to housing. And so what we need to do with private development is not make it jump through hoops. And this is true even more so for non-market housing, which is made to jump through ridiculous hoops, treated as an unwelcome unicorn every time it comes up. But that's also true of market housing at the moment. It's like every new development's treated like, oh my God, how is it going to pay for the terrible things it's doing to the surrounding community, instead of housing being a good thing and more of housing being a good thing. So one thing that really vexes me or worries me, and I think it worries a lot of people, is the fact that we are actually producing fewer homes in 2022 than we did in 1972, 50 years ago, when the population of Canada was about half what it is today, and households were larger. That is objectively a huge supply problem. And although absolutely we should be prioritizing increasing non-market supply, we also need to increase market supply, because otherwise we're not going to get lower rents, any kind of lower housing costs with 0% vacancy rates. We aren't going to get housing first with 0% vacancy rates.
Now, I'm sure you've seen this documentary video Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre recently released, entitled Housing Hell. And in it, he documents the challenges and experiences ordinary Canadians face with this housing affordability crisis. But his policy prescription basically says we need to get government out of housing, even though for decades the federal government has washed its hands of housing. What do you make of these conservative perspectives on the housing crisis?
Well, in a sense, I think Mr. Poilievre is responding to something that's desperately needed, which are some simple explainers on a lot of the jargon that we just talked about, like affordable housing for whom, what does non-market housing be? I think that there is a lot of public interest in housing right now, and a lot of what we talk about is surrounded by jargon. So I want to begin by saying having a 5-minute explainer out there, great. There are some people who are producing really good short explainers, and I think people are using YouTube and TikTok and all kinds of social media platform in order to get their information. So that's great. I would love to see the NDP and the Liberals doing that as well. I'd love to see advocacy groups doing that more effectively. It's an odd video because it starts off by using a lot of talking points that have been brought up by various housing researchers, including talking about Singapore as a great exemplar. Well, the thing about Singapore is when it won independence from Britain in 1964, the government saw a huge housing shortage, and it responded by appropriating most of the land in Singapore. 90% of the land in Singapore is owned by the Singapore government. 80% of people in Singapore live in public housing. It is public housing that's sold, but because the government owns land rights in a mechanism that's similar to what in Canada we call a community land trust, they can determine the price. They can determine the allocation. They've determined allocation by, for instance, ethnicity. They don't want developments that are all Chinese origin people, or all Malaysian origin people, or all Indian origin people. So when Mr. Poilievre brings that up as an example, I actually think that that's much more interventionist than I've heard any party ever talk about. But of course, he doesn't follow it through. He doesn't say, yep, let's appropriate all land and let's allocate all housing according to need, and let's make sure that every development is ethnically mixed, because I don't think that fits in with the conservative ideology. Okay, but there are all these points that are brought up about student homelessness and about housing prices having increased, although again, there's a bit of a clangor in there where he says housing prices were just fine between 1867 and 2015. And, a few journalists have gotten in touch with me and I've said, I don't know of any stats from 1867. I can tell you some figures from 1880. That's about as far back as we can go. But in any case, it's not true. Median house prices started getting unaffordable in relation to median income around about 1980. They have continued to climb fairly steadily for the last 3-4 decades. Yes, they've gotten even higher since 2015, but it's just a falsehood to say that it was all stable and lovely before 2015. There were a lot of scary signs by 2015. But then at the end of the video, Mr. Poilievre sort of ends up by saying, and the answer to all of this is no government spending. And you almost get whiplash because everything he said actually talks about the need for some kind of intervention. Even when the Conservatives say we are going to set targets and link it to infrastructure money for municipalities, that's government intervention. It's costly to keep track of that. It's costly to link it to infrastructure funding. So the notion that cutting government spending is a magic bullet solution is bears no resemblance to the rest of the video.
And so what Pierre Poilievre is saying here about Singapore actually reminds me a lot about industrial strategy, something we like to talk a lot about here at the Broadbent Institute, and Ed speaks about in his new book, Seeking Social Democracy, where intervening public policy from the state shapes industry, coordinates markets to pursue goals like social equality, climate action, and in this case, housing inequality. But what, in your view, does industrial policy look like for Canada? The Singapore example sounds good on paper, but obviously this needs translation into the Canadian context.
Well, also Singapore is essentially a city-state. So, you have one level of government, which makes things a little bit easier. It's part of the reason why, I talk a bit about Singapore, but I wouldn't use it as a workable example for Canada. There are, however, three-level states such as France, Germany, that have done some interesting things and are worth looking at. In any case, what would an industrial strategy look like for Canada? And I agree with you, Clement, that all three levels are all three political parties rather are slowly coming around to the notion that there does need to be an industrial strategy, partly because there's labor shortages, just like there's labor shortages in the health sector and in the education sector. And I would argue for the same reason, which is that people are not earning enough to support themselves where they are most needed. So that's a basic problem. So I think an industrial strategy. Let me give Sweden as an example. In 1965, Sweden had an objective housing shortage. It also had a low and moderate income housing shortage, as it analyzed, and as Canada could very easily analyze. And it decided to have industrialized housing. So municipalities got support from the senior level of government to acquire land, because land cost is one of the big components of housing cost. There were standardized design that was based on evidence about what's an efficient kitchen, what's an efficient living room, what's appropriate for, even in the 1960s, Sweden was a little further ahead in terms of gender equality, what makes for an easier home life. And there were contracts with developers who were supposed to be producing homes at a particular price point that was affordable, certainly to moderate income people. And there were further subsidies available for low income people. So the notion was housing for everyone. And there were, in many cases, there were single family homes. And one of the myths about Sweden was it was all apartment buildings, but there were a number of apartment buildings that were built in new neighborhoods that were well connected by public transit and had lots of services nearby. And the important thing was the Swedish government said, we're going to build 1 million homes. They're going to be from 1 to 4 bedrooms. They are going to meet the needs of Swedes. Local governments are responsible for understanding those needs. And then we will work with and provide financing for this kind of adequate housing. And it built 1 million homes in a decade, which in Canada would be 6 million homes in a decade if you sort of look at the population of Canada today. And everyone's going, oh my God, the CMHC says we need 5.8 million homes by 2030 in order to solve affordability problems. That's unattainable. But countries have done it. Canada had a huge building program post-war. Singapore, as I mentioned, had a huge building program after it gained independence. Japan, Germany, I could go on and on about places that did huge rebuilding after a great deal more trauma and with a great deal less money than Canada has had. I don't know why we keep on treating it like it's impossible. So if you ask me what a good NDP industrial strategy would look like, it starts off with looking at current need, looking at population projections, looking at who needs what housing, where, and at what cost, and then devising the policy settings, which would include federal policy settings, provincial policy settings, and municipal policy settings, or regional policy settings that would help meet those needs. I mean, there's no shortcut to that. It has to be federal leadership. It has to be based on what people can afford, and the policy settings need to work backwards from what people can afford to how can we make housing cheaper.
So clearly there is a massive responsibility by the federal government, despite what the Prime Minister said, that it's not a federal government responsibility. But I want to turn to something that also defies the borders of government jurisdiction, and I've seen it more and more come up in the housing discourse in Canada, and that's immigration as a driver of the crisis. In particular, we see the explosion in the exploitation of international students who are used, quite frankly, to prop up educational institutions where public funding has been cut, to work precariously in gig economy jobs without the protections of organized labor or real labor laws because of their status, with the false promises from exploitative recruiters in their home countries that this is a pathway to permanent residency. If housing really is a human right, immigration policy is in the federal realm, what change needs to happen to reconcile this labor and housing crisis before immigrants become more widely scapegoated for this policy failure?
I will agree with you. This whole notion that we need a lot of new migrants in order to, and let me start off by saying I am an absolutely open border person. I think in times of coming climate change, we haven't begun to see the kind of immigration that I suspect we're going to need to see in the next few years. We take in lots and lots of migrant workers who live in hideous, inhumane conditions. We say that we need labor, just like Qatar needs labor, and we're going to bring people in because no way would a local person want to work for that little money. You know, that's essentially what we're saying. So to me, absolutely, immigration policy needs to be linked to education policy, needs to be linked to housing policy. But let's not fool ourselves. If we stopped immigration tomorrow, we would still have a huge deficit and an aging population and, a lot of humane reasons ranging from family unification to the needs of asylum seekers in order to have immigration. And we'd still have a housing crisis. Stopping immigration wouldn't stop a housing crisis. Having said that, Canada's population grew by almost 500,000 people in the last, I think, 3 months. It is really growing quickly. I wouldn't argue that we need to stop immigration in its tracks. I would argue that we need a housing policy that is worthy of all people living in Canada. And again, part of sort of the right to housing is it isn't just housing for Canadian citizens, it's everyone living in Canada. So when we take on someone moving to Canada, we take on the responsibility of housing them. And part of the problem is that in 1991, when Canada started calculating core housing need, as it calls it, this census-based measurement of who is in inadequate housing, homeless people weren't included. People living in congregate housing, whether it was people living in long-term care or people living in rooming houses or people living in group homes, they weren't included in core housing need. Students were not included in core housing need. They still aren't included in core housing need. And they need to be, because they're real. They're actual human beings who rent and who crowd the rental market, which is insufficient to meet the needs of any of those groups: low-income people, students, people who need supports, older people. I could go on and on and on. So we have this deficit that actually the roots of the deficit, the rental deficit or the low-cost deficit, started in the 1970s, got much worse in the 1990s when the federal government abandoned responsibility for housing policy, saying that it was a provincial responsibility, and then province said, oh no, it's municipal responsibility, at least in Ontario. So we have decades of chickens coming home to roost. And I feel that that's true about education, including tertiary education, because we know that the reason why there are a lot of international students being accepted is because it seems to be the only way for tertiary education to, like colleges and universities, to support themselves. That's ridiculous. People need college and university education in order to get a job. That's a basic need right now, just like primary education was a basic need in the 19th century. We know that people need good health care. So the more that we put an austerity culture on good health care, the more that expensive health issues are going to show up. And again, that's going to add to personal debt, and eventually it will have an impact on societal productivity. So the sooner we start looking at those basic needs/rights and start taking the collective wealth of the 10th wealthiest country in the world to address them, the happier we're going to be.
And in this shying away of governments being responsible for housing since the 1990s, coinciding with trends like increasing food bank usage and more homelessness in cities, we see the retrenchment at the federal, provincial, and municipal levels of social services overall, with the argument that it all costs too much. And with the housing crisis itself, it's a big spending item for governments to consider, even if they do have the appetite to get back into housing. What I think makes them more reluctant is this concern that, budgets will become unbalanced, taxes might go up, and everything built on these inflated home prices could disappear. So what do you say to those folks who see the costs and say, no, we can't afford action on housing?
Well, I'd say two things. The first is, of course, we are spending a ridiculous amount of money on terrible housing conditions right now. Canada has one of the highest levels of GDP involved in housing, 14% of GDP. Most of that is in the speculative selling and reselling of single-family homes, and in some cases in selling and reselling apartment buildings and condos. That only produces 2% of the employment in Canada. It's one of the least productive sectors in Canada. A recent report for the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association from Deloitte Consultants found that Canada's productivity would increase by 5% per year simply by doubling the amount of non-market housing. Why? Because building new housing creates jobs. Speculating in existing housing only creates jobs in like real estate and marketing. That's true of all housing. So increasing market housing would also increase jobs. The secret sauce of non-market housing is that, for instance, for every homeless person, including people with severe mental illness, who are given a permanent home with appropriate supports, $21,000 a year is gained for each person who finds a home. So what we're doing is displacing costs. So, the costs of policing, clearing out encampments, people having to seek shelter in not just emergency shelters, but also emergency rooms. The pipeline between jails and homelessness, that endless cycle, that is incredibly costly and wasteful. A lot of those costs are picked up by the provincial government and particularly municipal governments, but it is a really costly system we have now with absolutely brutal outcomes. Homeless people have life expectancies half that of people who have permanent, secure housing. So we have a terrible, expensive system with terrible outcomes right now. It's like climate change. You can ignore it. You can say, "Ooh, we don't have the money to address it," but the next time you're dealing with a fire or a flood or the loss of precious habitat, you might rethink where you're investing your money. And housing is infrastructure. It's like saying, hey, we don't have the money for a bridge, so how about, we don't have a bridge? And that's not really the way that any government should be working.
It's interesting that you say housing is infrastructure, because that also brings to mind other pieces of infrastructure like highways or public transit infrastructure that governments are in charge of, and these things take a long time to build before you see a return or the success of that build. For most governments, infrastructure projects extend way past electoral timelines where the investments made today towards the future can be perceived as too costly in the present, considering this electoral window.
Absolutely. So when I say housing as infrastructure, and I say that there is a 30 to 50-year backlog of affordable housing, this isn't something that's going to be solved in one term of government. You have to start talking in infrastructure terms, which is a 30 to 50-year timeline. We have the majority of affordable apartments were built 50, 40 to 60 years ago, and they need major upgrades, just like any infrastructure needs major upgrades after 40 to 60 years. We can't keep on neglecting it because it's falling down, but it's so wrong-headed that Canada has the highest level of personal debt in the world, largely fueled by housing, and has one of the lowest levels of social spending. At some point, something's got to give. And I could give many more examples of poor places. I mean, Vienna after World War I, my gosh, it was lying in rubble. It had lost a war. Or for that matter, Japan after 1945, it had lost a war. It was in rubble. And those incredibly poor countries managed to rebuild. And in the case of Vienna, build really solid non-market housing that still continues to successfully house people in a revolving loan fund that is a sustainable housing system. So, we don't need wealth in order to build housing. Housing builds wealth, as it did in Singapore. But the more we ignore basic needs like housing and health and education, the poorer we're actually going to become as a society.
And so sticking with that variable of time, something like these massive programs that basically built housing starting from scratch out of post-war economic devastation, which obviously isn't the Canadian historical experience, these generational programs certainly have had implications for housing affordability in these countries today. And at the same time, the generational policies that are being tried today in Canada to jumpstart increases in non-market housing supply also have been coming into something like generational conflicts. We see young people demand changes to local housing rules that older folks oppose. Intergenerational wealth transfers make haves and have-nots within generations, and older generations can come to the fear that their welfare becomes threatened if the value of their homes is made to become more affordable. So how do we reconcile this intergenerational conflict?
It's virtually impossible for anyone under 40 to buy a house these days unless they have some parental wealth behind them. And it really worries me that Canada is becoming a country of inherited wealth rather than one that is, has equality of opportunity. So, I think that private developers are absolutely right, especially since they're saying the same thing as non-market developers, which is there are all these insane constraints that stop us from building well-located housing to where it's most wanted and needed. So in that case, there does need to be more consistent regulation, less regulation in some cases. But at the same time, if we have so many renters, and we've never had less than a third of households being renters, and at the moment we have considerably more than a third who are renters, even if we only had a tenth of people who are renters, they still need rights. They still need protection from eviction. They still need, some basic security of tenure. A lot of richer countries, Germany, Austria, Denmark, etc., have majority renter societies. They also have very generous welfare systems for older people so that they aren't dependent on selling their house to fuel their entire retirement. So again, we're beggaring ourselves through the current system.
And wrapping up here, the big question. In your Globe and Mail piece from the past summer, you wrote, Canada's progressive parties have lost the plot on the housing crisis, but since that time, we've also seen a number of policy changes and spending announcements from progressive administrations across Canada. And so in your view today, since writing that article, what are progressives getting wrong and right about housing affordability?
Well, for the life of me, I don't understand why the federal NDP isn't looking to the BC NDP, who at the moment have the most pro-housing policies in Canada. They're doing really rapid reforms, and I agree with 90% of those reforms. And they are soaring in the polls, absolutely soaring in the polls. I look at the election of Olivia Chow, a quite unexpected election. She won on a very pro-housing platform, and she's been working really hard and making progress where the previous Tory, both literal and figurative, mayor was unable to make any progress with both the provincial and federal government. So those are two really great exemplars to use when the NDP is putting together its housing platform for the next election. The Liberal Party made a very, very, very good move when it got the current housing minister. But one of the issues is that housing ministers, both Tory and Liberal, since the 1940s, have come up with very ambitious plans which have then been stomped on by finance ministers. And as long as you have a finance minister who's unwilling to either take on debt in terms of providing grants for instance, the Rapid Housing Initiative, which is an initiative that has been the most successful of the National Housing Strategy in terms of its stated targets to reduce homelessness and core housing need. That's really the only program that's shown big benefits. It needs to become a permanent program, but my understanding is that the finance minister doesn't want to take on the level of debt that's going to be involved in, or investment actually, that's going to be involved in rehousing people who have become homeless. There also seems to be some reluctance to use the system which worked very well in the 1980s, which was long-term secure financing for non-market housing. So, you can't get to heaven without dying. You can't get the kind of housing we need without some kind of investment in the housing that's needed by the people who need them the most. I've recently completed some research that shows that there are 3 million households, mostly single-person households, who need homes at less than $1,000 a month in 2021 terms. A significant proportion of those people, about 300,000 at least, need homes at less than $420 a month because they're on welfare and that's what they can afford. So either, we get in universal basic income, even if we got in universal basic income and very low income households moved up to minimum wage, you would still, and even minimum wage went up slightly to the levels they were at during COVID with CERB, you would still need millions of homes at $1,000 a month. That's the challenge. Work your way backwards from policies that will produce housing for low-income people and start including the needs of people who have not been included before. And that includes long-term care, it includes students, it includes the masses of young families who are moving 100 kilometers away with all of the environmental sprawl that entails in order to get affordability. Move to an industrial strategy, as you said, Clement.
Lastly, as an expert to the Housing Resource and Assessment Tools HEART project at the University of British Columbia, could you speak a bit more about your work on that project?
Sure. We've been funded by the CMHC to do what the CMHC used to do, which is provide analysis of housing need by income category and household size and priority population. We also have looked at something that the current government is suddenly very interested in, which is use of government land for non-market affordable housing, which again has been the secret behind Canada's success in the past, many other countries' success. We also have a really good acquisitions tool, and one of the things that the Canadian government has to do is make sure that all of those high-rise apartment buildings that were built 40 to 60 years ago stay affordable. And one of the ways to do that is to have them be acquired by non-market housing providers, along with funding for renovations, but without rehousing those people. Our website is heart.ubc.ca, H-A-R-T, being heart. And we are currently applying for a grant to look at how we can scale up non-market housing on government land.
Professor Carolyn Whitzman, thank you for joining me for this discussion on the Perspectives Journal podcast.
A pleasure, Clement. Thank you.
That was Professor Carolyn Whitzman, Housing and Social Policy Consultant, Expert Advisor to the Housing Assessment Resource Tools Project at the University of British Columbia, and Adjunct Professor at the University of Ottawa. And if you like this interview, share and subscribe to Perspectives, a journal of Canadian political economy and social democracy, on all major podcast platforms, as well as Press Progress's Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories you won't find in the major papers. You can read more in Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca.